When we talk about the most influential artists of the 20th century, names like Bob Dylan, the Beatles, or David Bowie often dominate the conversation. But sitting quietly, without flamboyant outfits or blockbuster tours, is a woman whose words and melodies changed the face of music, Joni Mitchell. Born in Canada, misunderstood by her industry, and often underestimated in pop culture, Mitchell crafted a musical legacy rooted in poetry, vulnerability, rebellion, and innovation. Her journey is not just about music. It's about art, womanhood, and the radical act of telling the truth, even when it hurts. Joni Mitchell was born Roberta Joanne Anderson on November 7, 1943, in Fort Macleod, Alberta, Canada. Raised in the prairies, she was exposed to a wide range of music from an early age, but her first love was painting. In many ways, this early passion for visual art shaped her approach to music later in life. She didn't just write songs, she painted with sound. As a child, she contracted polio during the Canadian epidemic of 1951, and doctors feared she could never. As a child, she contracted polio during the Canadian epidemic of 1951, and doctors feared she would never walk again. But she recovered. And perhaps more importantly, the long months in recovery gave her time to think and imagine. It was during that time that music first became a kind of salvation. Mitchell taught herself how to play ukulele and eventually guitar, but even this came with limitations. Because the polio left her with weakened muscles in her left hand, she developed a unique system of alternate tunings, over 50 different ones, which gave her sound a dreamy, otherworldly quality. What started as a limitation became one of her greatest creative advantages. Mitchell's early music career wasn't glamorous. She began by playing folk clubs in Canada and later moved to the US, where she performed in coffee houses and clubs. At a time when the folk scene was heavily male-dominated, Mitchell was often talked over, patronized, or treated like a novelty. Her songwriting quickly distinguished her from the rest, however. Other artists noticed her talent before the public did. Judy Collins recorded Mitchell's song, Both Sides Now, in 1967, turning it into a hit. But Mitchell's own version, released later, feels more intimate and weary, as if she were already looking back on life with a kind of poetic sorrow, even in her 20s. In 1968, she released her debut album, Song to a Seagull, produced by David Crosby of the Byrds. But it wasn't until her third album, Ladies of the Canyon, in 1970, that she began to gain wider acclaim, with songs like Big Yellow Taxi and Woodstock becoming generational anthems. In 1971, Joni Mitchell released what is now widely considered one of the greatest albums of all time, Blue. It's a masterclass in emotional honesty, chronicling the highs and devastating lows of romantic love, loneliness, identity, and self-worth. To understand Blue, you have to understand where Mitchell was emotionally. She had recently ended relationships with fellow musicians Graham Nash and James Taylor. She was worn down by fame and unsure of where she fit in an industry that wanted her to be digestible, easily labeled as a folk singer, a muse, or a girlfriend of male stars. Instead, she delivered Blue, an album that cracked her open completely. Instead, she delivered Blue, an album that cracked her open completely. I'm frightened by the devil, and I'm drawn to those ones that ain't afraid, she sings in A Case of You. In River, she mourns a breakup through the metaphor of frozen landscapes, and in the title track, she confesses, songs are like tattoos I've been to see before, crown and anchor me, or let me sail away. It wasn't just the emotional intensity that made Blue revolutionary. It was how rare it was to hear a woman sing so openly, so personally, without hiding behind metaphor or narrative distance. In a time when women in pop were often stylized, produced, and polished by male record labels, Mitchell wrote, arranged, and produced the entire album herself. After Blue, many expected Mitchell to stay in the same lane. Instead, she shocked the music world by continuously reinventing herself. With albums like Court and Spark and Igira, Mitchell blended jazz, rock, and folk into something entirely her own. Collaborations with jazz legends like Jaco Pastorius and Charles Mingus pushed her music even further outside of mainstream expectations. Her lyrics also evolved, taking on more complex themes like existential wandering, the price of fame, and global unrest. In a road trip album written during a solo cross country drive, Mitchell wrestles with the tension between freedom and loneliness. She says, I'm porous with travel fever, she writes, but I'm so glad to be on my own. She wasn't afraid to take risks, even if it meant losing commercial success. As the 1980s approached and popular music shifted towards synth pop and stadium rock, Mitchell stayed her course. Her 1985 album, Dog Eat Dog, incorporated synthesizers but kept her lyrical complexity. She refused to chase trends. Joni Mitchell wasn't just fighting for artistic freedom. She was also constantly up against the music industry's sexism. Critics often focused more on her romantic relationships with famous men than on her groundbreaking music. She was called aloof, difficult, or too intellectual, labels rarely given to her male counterparts. But Mitchell always refused to play the role of the quiet, palatable woman. She once said in an interview with the Rolling Stone, I was never a groupie. I was never a muse. I was the one writing the songs. In doing so, she paved the way for future generations of female singer-songwriters like Tori Amos, Fiona Apple, Alanis Morissette, and even Taylor Swift. Artists like Prince and Bjork, artists like Prince and Bjork have cited her as a major influence, not just for her music, but for her fearless independence. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Mitchell slowed her musical output, turning more attention back to her painting. But even as she retreated from the spotlight, her legacy continued to grow. Her lyrics were studied in universities. Her albums were reissued and rediscovered by younger generations. Health struggles in the 2010s, including a near fatal brain aneurysm in 2015, kept her out of the public eye for years. Many thought she would never perform again, but in a stunning comeback, Joni Mitchell made a surprise return to the stage at the 2022 Newport Folk Festival, singing in public for the first time in over a decade. In 2023, she received the Library of Congress Gershwin Prize for Popular Song, a recognition of her genius long overdue. Joni Mitchell's story is more than that. Joni Mitchell's story is more than the story of a brilliant songwriter. It's the story of a woman who refused to be reduced. She was not content to be someone's muse. She wasn't afraid to be complex or controversial or sad. She wrote about things women were told not to say out loud: grief, abortion, self doubt, artistic pride. She made music not just for radio play, but for truth. And in doing so, she expanded the idea of what a woman in music could be. Not just a voice, not just a face, but a whole mind. As younger artists continue to cite her influence, from Brandy Carlisle to Phoebe Bridgers, we can see clearly that Joni Mitchell didn't just shape music. She redefined what it means to be an artist, to make something that reflects the world and reshapes it. In her own words, I'm a painter who writes songs. My songs are very visual. The words create scenes. And we, the listeners, are lucky enough to walk through those scenes, one breathtaking lyric at a time. If you like this video, consider subscribing to First Story Behind the Canvas, where we explore the hidden histories of female artists who shaped the world, whether or not the world remembers them. Thanks for watching.